So in this second part of the presentation, I'm going to cover really three areas. I'm going to give a little brief introduction to the United Nations organization. And then I'm going to focus on human rights. And towards the end, then I'm going to tell you about the Human Rights Council. So I'm going to speak on three things: the UN organization, human rights, and the operation of the Human Rights Council. So bear with me while I share my screen. So to speak first of all about the United Nations organization and what are the objectives of the UNO? Why was the UNO established? Well, one of the reasons for its establishment was to bring about cooperation in international law. And the second reason for it was to work on international security. Economic development was another matter it was responsible for, and social progress. Then we have the one that we're going to focus on tonight. The United Nations has a special interest in the promotion and the protection and the strengthening of human rights. So that's one of the reasons that the UNO came into existence. And then also very much involved in world peace. So just take a moment to look at those six particular objectives of the United Nations. And remember that tonight we're focusing on the one that's highlighted in red, human rights, but just cast your eye over the six reasons for the establishment of the United Nations. And I hope that the people who are following in Spanish are getting the message as well. So moving on, there are six principal organs of the UNO, and I'm going to name the six, and most of them you will have heard of before. They won't be strange to you. The first one is the General Assembly of the UN, which meets in New York. And the second one is the Security Council, again, meeting in New York. Then there's the Economic and Social Council, which again meets in New York. So these three bodies of the UNO are all based in New York: the General Assembly, the Security Council, and the Economic and Social Council. The International Court of Justice is based in The Hague. And there's a vast secretariat that supports the work of all the various parts of the UN organization. So the secretariat is an important background, working in the background, supporting the work of the General Assembly, the Security Council, Economic and Social Council, and many other groups and organizations under the umbrella of the UN. And a final organ is the Trusteeship Council, which is now, if you like, defunct. The UNO came into existence in 1948 after the Second World War. And at that time, the Trusteeship Council was dealing with countries that were seeking independence. And that no longer kind of is very much needed. So the Trusteeship Council has been kind of inactive for quite some time. So these are the six principal organizations in the UN. Now, as well as those six, the UN oversees a range of other subsidiary bodies. There are many committees and boards and working parties that the UN has, in addition to the six main organs that I mentioned there. And the Human Rights Council is one of the most important of these subsidiary bodies. And later on, I'm going to be speaking about the Human Rights Council. So that's my little presentation about the United Nations. And I finished there by mentioning a subsidiary body, and the important one being the Human Rights Council. So I'm moving on now to the second part of the presentation, where we focus on human rights. And my basic question is, what are human rights? And I'll give you 30 seconds to see for yourself. Could you name some human rights? What human rights come to mind when you hear that term, human rights? And if we take the actual individual words, take the word human, and we think of what human means, a member of Homo sapiens, a man, a woman, a child, a person. So human rights, we're dealing with people. And then rights, things to which you're entitled or allowed, freedoms that are guaranteed or protected. So rights can be thought of in two ways, entitlements and freedoms. And how are they promoted? How are they protected? How are they strengthened? And human rights, then, you could say very simply, the rights you have simply because you are human. We all have them, every one of us, each individual person has human rights. And if you were to ask people in the street, what are human rights? You would get many different answers. Some people would say, I don't know the answer. Other people would name certain rights, like the right to education, the right to freedom of speech, and so on. But in many cases, people would be baffled by the question. They wouldn't be aware that they have human rights or mightn't be able to name any human rights. And as mentioned in the definition above, a right is a freedom of some kind. It's something to which you're entitled by virtue of being human. So human rights do have connections with freedom and protecting that freedom and ensuring that people enjoy it. Now I'm going to share my screen again and show you a video which explains a bit further about human rights.
The idea of human rights is that each one of us, no matter who we are or where we are born, is entitled to the same basic rights and freedoms. Human rights are not privileges, and they cannot be granted or revoked. They are inalienable and universal. That may sound straightforward enough, but it gets incredibly complicated as soon as anyone tries to put the idea into practice. What exactly are the basic human rights? Who gets to pick them? Who enforces them, and how? The history behind the concept of human rights is a long one. Throughout the centuries and across societies, religions, and cultures, we have struggled with defining notions of rightfulness, justice, and rights. But one of the most modern affirmations of universal human rights emerged from the ruins of World War II with the creation of the United Nations. The treaty that established the UN gives as one of its purposes to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. And with the same spirit, in 1948, the UN General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This document, written by an international committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, lays the basis for modern international human rights law. The Declaration is based on the principle that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. It lists 30 articles recognizing, among other things, the principle of non-discrimination and the right to life and liberty. It refers to negative freedoms, like the freedom from torture or slavery, as well as positive freedoms, such as the freedom of movement and residence. It encompasses basic civil and political rights, such as freedom of expression, religion, or peaceful assembly, as well as social, economic, and cultural rights, such as the right to education and the right to freely choose one's occupation and be paid and treated fairly. The Declaration takes no sides as to which rights are more important, insisting on their universality, indivisibility, and interdependence. And in the past decades, international human rights law has grown, deepening and expanding our understanding of what human rights are and how to better protect them. So if these principles are so well developed, then why are human rights abused and ignored time and time again all over the world? The problem, in general, is that it is not at all easy to universally enforce these rights or to punish transgressors. The UDHR itself, despite being highly authoritative and respected, is a declaration, not a hard law. So when individual countries violate it, the mechanisms to address those violations are weak. For example, the main bodies within the UN in charge of protecting human rights mostly monitor and investigate violations, but they cannot force states to, say, change a policy or compensate a victim. That's why some critics say it's naive to consider human rights a given in a world where state interests wield so much power. Critics also question the universality of human rights and emphasize that their development has been heavily guided by a small number of mostly Western nations, to the detriment of inclusiveness. The result? A general bias in favor of civil political liberties over socio-political rights, and of individual over collective or groups' rights. Others defend universal human rights laws and point at the positive role they have on setting international standards and helping activists in their campaigns. They also point out that not all international human rights instruments are powerless. For example, the European Convention on Human Rights establishes a court where the 47 member countries and their citizens can bring cases. The court issues binding decisions that each member state must comply with. Human rights law is constantly evolving, as are our views and definitions of what the basic human rights should be. For example, how basic or important is the right to democracy or to development? And as our lives are increasingly digital, should there be a right to access the internet? A right to digital privacy? What do you think?
So that video gave you an overview of human rights, how they were developed, mentioned some of the human rights, talked about the fact that sometimes they're not enforced or they're not delivered as they were intended. And also that there are times too when they have developed and have grown over the years. So I'm going to return then to my PowerPoint presentation. So again, just bear with me while I return. So moving on then, as I said in the video, human rights are universal and inalienable. That means they apply to all people everywhere, at all times, and they can't be denied, they can be denied or violated, but they still do exist. So important words to remember about human rights: universal and inalienable. They're also indivisible. They're all equally important, all must be respected. And the last word, they're interdependent and interrelated. The fulfillment of one right often depends wholly or in part on fulfillment of others. For example, we talk about a right to education, but if children are arriving in school hungry, they mightn't be able to benefit from the education. So there's a right to food and the right to social protection. And those two rights, if you like, complement one another. There also can be, sometimes when we move on, there can be a need to balance between human rights. As you saw in the video, there's freedom of speech and there's the right to privacy. There can be a clash there. How do you balance the two of those? And one thing to remember is no country has a perfect record on human rights. Here in Geneva, at the Human Rights Council, when countries are being reviewed, we often see the places where they're falling down, where they're lacking. And indeed, in recent times, across the world, there's been a kind of a backsliding on human rights. We can see it now at the present time in places like Ukraine, and indeed in countries where there's been kind of an increase in nationalism. And I would use the word backsliding on human rights. Now, moving on to ask another question, who is responsible for ensuring human rights? And I'll give you a moment to ponder that question. So in a way, you could say that each of us is responsible. We all have human rights, and we're responsible for ensuring that everyone enjoys human rights. So it comes back to every one of us. And then two important groups of people are rights holders and duty bearers. We're all rights holders. Each one of us as a human person, man, woman, child, we're entitled. We have human rights. We're the rights holders. Who are the duty bearers? Well, the duty bearers are generally, say, governments, people in positions of leadership, groups that have responsibilities in society, teachers, for example, parents are duty bearers. So there's always a kind of a dialogue going on between rights holders and duty bearers. And one important thing is that rights holders need to become aware of their rights. And that isn't always the case. People are not often aware of what their rights are. Part of ERI's work is trying to raise awareness among groups maybe that are marginalized about what their rights are. And when they become aware of their rights, the next step is then, can they find their voice to articulate their rights or maybe seek remedies to where their rights are being violated? And that could lead to challenging the duty bearers who hold power and responsibility. So you have that interplay between rights holders and duty bearers. Now, for a variety of reasons, some people cannot speak up for themselves. And so they need other people or other groups to speak up on their behalf. And that's where advocacy comes in. You can advocate on behalf of yourself, or you can advocate on behalf of other people. And if there are people who can't speak up for themselves, then it's up to groups like ERI and other NGOs to speak up for them. If the people let groups know what their issues are, they can speak on behalf of people who haven't yet found their voice. Now, an example of this occurred very recently. The Human Rights Council's meeting at the moment, this month of March in Geneva, and Edmund Rice International was asked to speak at the Human Rights Council on behalf of a group of NGOs in Myanmar who were afraid of reprisals. We know that over a year ago, there was a coup in Myanmar, a military takeover in Myanmar, and there are many human rights abuses there. And these groups in Myanmar had prepared a statement, but they were not prepared to deliver the statement. But Edmund Rice International agreed to deliver the statement on their behalf. So I'm again going to share my screen, and you'll see Brother Brian Bond from Edmund Rice International delivering the statement on behalf of the groups in Myanmar.
Mr. President, we thank the High Commissioner for her update on Myanmar. In 2021, an estimated 441,000 civilians became IDPs and 1,553 civilians were killed. By the beginning of 22, the situation continues to deteriorate. Of grave concern are the states of Chin, Kaya and Sagaing, where villages are victims of military crackdowns leading to mass arrests, torture, rape and arbitrary executions. Homes and livestock are plundered and subject to arson, while crops are burned and sabotaged with fecal matter and harmful chemicals to ensure starvation. Communication lines are also demolished to prevent the outside world from learning about these atrocities. As fatigued, famished and wounded IDPs flee their homes, the military pursue them into forests, sanctuaries and other villages, causing renewed displacement amid reduced access to food and medical supplies. Humanitarian workers who endeavour to assist them are at times beaten to death, while food aid is diverted for military purposes. We implore the Human Rights Council to urge the de facto military authorities to 1. Immediately cease all acts of violence against civilians, and 2. Allow unrestricted and non-discriminatory humanitarian assistance for IDPs. We also urge the international community to minimise the impact of sanctions on humanitarian organisations and enable aid delivery through effective exemptions. Thank you. Mr. President.
So there you saw Brian Bond delivering that statement on behalf of NGOs in Myanmar. It's an example of how the voice of people at local level where human rights are being violated can be brought to the international level in Geneva. And that's one of the major works that Eben Rice International does. We have connections with our advocacy partners in all parts of the world. And when they have an issue that they want brought to the attention of the international scene, they get in touch with us and we try to bring the local issue onto the international agenda. That's part of our advocacy work in ERI. So let me go back to my PowerPoint presentation for the final part about the Human Rights Council. So let me tell you then about the United Nations Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council is a UN body whose mission is to promote and protect human rights around the world. As I explained before, it's a subsidiary body of the UNO. And the Human Rights Council was established by the UN General Assembly on the 15th of March 2006, and it replaced a previous body which was called the UN Commission on Human Rights. So the Human Rights Council has been there for about 16 years. And it consists of state representatives and reports directly to the General Assembly. So the Human Rights Council is a political body with a comprehensive human rights mandate, established by the General Assembly and reporting to the General Assembly. The Council has 47 members elected for a staggered 3-year term of office on a regional basis. So from among all the states in the world, all the countries of the world, at any one particular time, the Council has 47 members and they serve for a period of 3 years. And the headquarters of the Human Rights Council is here in Geneva, Switzerland. And that's why the Eben Rice International team is based here in France, very close to Geneva, and our office is in Geneva, quite close to the United Nations buildings. What does the Human Rights Council do? Well, just a short summary. It investigates allegations of breaches of human rights in member states. In other words, it's all the time monitoring how are countries implementing their human rights obligations. And in addition to investigating, it also addresses human rights issues. And I mentioned a few here by way of example. So it can be concerned about freedom of association and assembly, freedom of belief and religion, It can be interested in women's rights or the rights of racial and ethnic minorities. What about the right to work? The right to seek asylum from persecution? These are just some of the examples of rights issues that the Human Rights Council takes a very close interest in. So the two things, investigating breaches of human rights and addressing human rights issues. Another way to maybe to describe the work of the Human Rights Council would be, it addresses violations, it promotes human rights assistance and education, it reviews states' human rights records, it works to prevent abuses, responds to emergencies, and serves as an international forum for human rights dialogue. So a lot of things that the Human Rights Council pays attention to in its work. And the Council holds regular sessions 3 times a year, in March, in June, and September. So the Human Rights Council is meeting at the moment in the month of March. Another important office to be aware of is the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And the Office of the High Commissioner has a mandate from the international community to promote and protect human rights. At the moment, the High Commissioner is Michelle Bachelet from Chile. And when the Human Rights Council meets, she makes reports to the Human Rights Council. So in the past month, she has been present at the council meetings quite often, reporting on various things she's been investigating or various issues she's been following up on. So the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is also something that people need to know about. And as it says there, it's headed by the High Commissioner, and she has a special mandate from the UN General Assembly. So that's a brief overview of the Human Rights Council and how it operates. Now, just to mention 2 documents that are important and that the Human Rights International team pays attention to. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which you heard about in the video, came into being in 1948 after the Second World War, and it was adopted by the General Assembly of the UN and became part of international law. And the second document then that's of interest is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The United Nations has got a number of conventions, and one of them is focused particularly on children. This came about in 1989, and it has been ratified by 195 countries. It's the convention that's the most ratified of all conventions. Some other conventions have only been ratified by a smaller number of countries, but the Convention on the Rights of the Child has been ratified by practically every country, all 195. And just to give you one article from the Universal Declaration, Article 25, and see what it says here. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social services. Now, you can excuse the language coming from 1948, but it's really emphasizing in this article that people have a right to family life, food, clothing, housing, medical care, social protection. And then to take a look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention outlines in detail the standards that apply to the needs of children and binds states to adhere to these standards. So this convention focused very particularly on children, on their rights and their well-being. And the convention is informed by 4 core principles. And these principles are non-discrimination, the best interests of the child, the right to life, survival, and development, and respect for the views of the child. So when you look in greater detail at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, you see that those 4 basic principles are developed in the 54 articles that make up the convention. And my final slide is a number of resources that you yourself can follow up on. And I'm going to give you a link to each of these resources for you to explore. And the first one is a video on human rights, which gives you the history of how human rights came about. And a second resource is just to take a look at the Human Rights Council on that link. And you can find out there greater details about the Human Rights Council, how it's made up, how it works, how it meets, and so on. And then if you want to learn more about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you can try that link. And finally, if you want to see more about the Convention on the Rights of the Child, you can go to that 4th link. So as you know, these webinars are being recorded, and you can look at this later on, and you have those links if you want to do further exploration on the United Nations, on the Human Rights Council, and on the Universal Declaration and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So that's the end of my presentation.